Back with Beowulf.
Back we are. We are part 4 of 5.
Yeah.
We'll stop at 5. That's plenty.
Is it though? Is it enough? Is it enough?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
We'll see. We'll see. Once we get to the end of the poem, well, I mean, there's the after party, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, let's jump in. So let's see, where do we leave last? It was
Grendel's mother.
Giant's Blade. Grendel's mother was defeated. He came back. He was Hrothgar was pondering the Giant's Blade, and so the poet just puts 23 lines of this, pondering the Giant's Blade, and it's just a handle, right? Because the blade's gone. Mm-hmm. It quenched the fires, right? And what's written on it is the story of the flood that drowned the race of Cain, which the poet is telling us, but the characters in the poem don't know anything about it. They're just looking at it, pondering the mysteries, which is really interesting choice. What do you think's going on there? It's a strange reason, strange use of irony.
Yeah.
There's a ton of irony in the film, or in the film. I'm still thinking about Batman.
Right.
It's still a ton of irony in the poem.
Yeah.
The poet is very skilled at its use, and here he's doing this business with the blade. It goes immediately from there to him talking about 50 years of his own rule. And anyway, I think what's going on here is that the poet is showing us how, in the moment, right? We know what we know, and this is kind of applies to irony in general, but the way that he uses it here exemplifies it, and the tremendous history of what has brought you to this place is typically hidden, and all you know is what's going on right now, and that's all you can do, and you might be staring right at it and not have any idea really how'd you get here. The bit about the flood and the race of Cain and all that kind of biblical stuff. But it does connect, right? So, but before we were talking about how the blade seemed to represent the initial wound, the ancient, like archetypal wound, or the ancient opposition that we all have to face at one point or another, which is, am I going to be a part of a tribe, or am I going to be rejected? What do I do with that? How do I navigate that and still do justice to my own needs and desires and aspirations? So he goes from there to pondering the 50 years of his reign. And I think it's really important that he does that at this point, because we're in a few more lines, we're going to be talking about how Beowulf ruled for 50 years.
Yeah.
Again, the poet is showing us by juxtaposition and without comment, just saying Hrothgar's 50 years, Beowulf's 50 years. And you make up your own, conclusions from that. But I think it's a gloriously understated way of showing how Hrothgar, as great as he was not the perfection that Beowulf is.
Or the newer resolution of what Beowulf is. The kind of the update, right? The integration of something more.
Right.
Yeah.
Because Beowulf is being presented as an ideal, you could say a cultural ideal, but I think it's a little bit too easy to try to wrap this up in a bubble of culture and say it's only that culture that this applies, because there's so much that's universal in the story. And understanding the cultures helps understand the nuances, but how to be a good ruler is something that any ruler has to face, and dealing with inner conflicts within your kingdom and all that sort of stuff. So he goes from this long discussion about this 50-year reign and how things have turned out well, and Beowulf is his great friend, and call me anytime you need any help or anything, I'm there for you. And he breaks down in tears, actually. Hrothgar does, which is again, it's an argument against the supposed hypermasculinity of the poem and the Anglo-Saxon world. It's true that he is, as an older man, is more able and allowed to express emotions of weakness and all that sort of stuff. Basically, because of his age, he's allowed to be softer. But at the same time, you know, that's an outpouring of emotion that if you were overly simplified in thinking of this, you might just, you know, dismiss it and say, well, no one's ever allowed to do that. But he does it in this poem. So much for that argument, you know. So there's that. So then Beowulf goes back to Geatland, and the first thing he does with this huge load of treasure that Hrothgar dumped on him as a reward for his great deeds is he gives it to Hygelac, the king of the Geats, immediately. Gives every last bit of it. What do you make of that?
I mean, honestly, I think it's a sign of a good leader, right? To kind of share the wealth, you know, and it's
a demonstration, an unfakeable demonstration of his devotion and his commitment to the collective. Because of this story is a lot, and many heroic narratives are about this balance between the great and mighty warrior and the collective that he's a part of. And especially this poem, there's a lot of this in there because Grendel's the dark reflection of that. He only seeks his own desires. Nothing for the collective. There is no collective. Yeah. It's just him and his mother, right? He's stuck in that nascent state. He's not mature enough to be a functioning member of a community, where of course Beowulf is. And now you might think, well, he's just giving over everything. He's getting nothing in return. And you could see that, I think, in some other stories, but in this one, the cultural understanding is that's the way things are done. And you gain in fame and renown for doing things like that. And it's a way that you can say that your honor is unshakable because you gave away all this stuff, right? So our modern culture is so hyper individualized that it's all about just piling up huge amounts of wealth and then strutting around, you know, flying into space and all that ridiculous crap. And there's not as much focus on how much are you giving away, you know, as much. So, but here it's a cultural script that the good warrior does.
Yeah, and Beowulf was it was the cultural understanding probably stemmed from this understanding that he was a representation of his people, right? That his ability was from it's that through line, right? That his ability was of his peoples, and yeah, it's not individualistic, nor is it at the other end of the spectrum where it's that look at how great he is, and there's that kind of boiling resentment there.
Right.
No, we are one, and those that are the best of us are still a part of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas before we were shown the contrast between Beowulf and Grendel, and how Beowulf and Grendel's mother, and how he gains in strength through his connection to others in the sort of trusted bond of a community. So the poet, through this imagery, argues that the best way to reinforce that is essentially kind of pay it forward, right? You gained all this treasure in part because of the strength you gained from being a part of who we are. So you bring it back and you give glory to yourself, right? It is a little bit of self-aggrandizement there, but only in how much you give and how much you, but not at the expense of yourself, because, like, you know, that balance we were talking about last time, and this has come up a number of times with the Batman video too, is the idea of the sacrifice where the hero is expected to give up everything they ever wanted for the greater good of society, and how that is a little bit too extreme in some cases. The Dark Knight Rises managed to find a great balance there with that. And but here the contrast isn't nearly so sharp. it's not presented as the individual versus the greater society that's putting all these demands on them. That's a modern phenomenon. So in Freud's great influential book, Civilization and Its Discontents, right? Have you heard of this book?
Oh yeah, I've read it. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So then you know that in there he talks about how the main problem is the individual versus society.
Yep.
The individual wants this based on id needs and all that sort of thing, and has to put up with society telling them what to do and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think he probably nailed a very accurate piece of information for his day.
Yes.
That is true of how societies were then and now, for the most part. But that's not how ancient societies were. These people were with each other all the time, for the most part. And so there was a bond there that we don't seem to get here. So we have this hyper-individualist culture, but we've got this faceless mass as the society that we're a part of. And so we often get this dichotomy between what I want and what they want, right? These them that comes from the media. Absolutely. I think it's an illusion. But that's a whole other conversation. In Beowulf's world, because the community offers him a lot of strength and reassurance and nurturing, he gets so much nurturing. When his father disappeared on him, right? He went off on some stupid frivolous raid and got his silly butt killed. Ecgtheow ran off and got killed, and he left him without a father. But he was able to latch on to Hreidel, his grandfather. And there's this sort of bond of brotherhood that he has with Hygelac that is strongly represented in the poem. And this is another reflection of that. And you don't feel like he's giving up everything of himself here, even though he literally just dumps all his treasure. So it's really cool how that shows up. And some of that's not the poet's doing. It's the fact he's just reflecting what people actually did. Yeah. So it may be teaching us a lesson about modern society and how some of the things we do aren't as good as they used to be. Not to get stuck in the past, but there you go. Then the poet goes on to this stuff about queens, and I have to say a little bit about this because it's really interesting. We've already talked about Whaleveyo and the contrast between her and Grendel's mother, right? The peace weaver and the not peace weaver. But then he gives us a couple more to ponder, a couple more queens to think about in terms of anima figures. And one of them is Mode 3, though. I'm probably butchering the name, but that's how she's pronounced, I think. Anyway, the poet goes on the sidebar about her. She's this, she was a queen in her younger days who was just vindictive and vengeful. And anyone just barely, looked at her, she would get offended and have them put to death, right? But then Offa, who was a Swedish king, I believe, and he was very famous in his day, they married and she calmed down. So it's kind of a taming of the shrew sort of story. In contrast to her and her change, we have the vengeful, brutal, angry, switching over to a calm and happy and peaceful sort of feminine character. He tells us this story right after Grendel's mother is dealt with. So it's difficult for me to not see the parallel there, how she was this vengeful force of death and destruction, but then not so much. It's in fantastical terms first, then he gives us an example in the real world. See, interesting. Now, I remember coming across this one book I read that it was written in the 90s. It was looking at that particular interlude there from a lens of 90s feminism, right? From however you feel about that. And she was saying that Mothritho's actions, she didn't come right out and say they were justified, but basically was saying that she was acting this way because she was rebelling against sexual objectification. And I can remember reading that and going, this is another one of these, let's put a modern lens on top of something that was written 1,000 years ago. Yeah. see how much sense it doesn't make, because I thought, okay, at first I thought, okay, maybe it is. Maybe it's an ancient reflection of this idea. Now, the modern author, and I won't name it, the book, because I don't want to bring hate on anybody, but this author was saying that that story was depicting women in this sort of, again, let's take away all their power and that sort of thing. Let's talk about how women don't have any power in this society and so forth. And they did this by showing her head, exerting her power, but then getting tamed, right? And I can remember reading this and I was like, well, I'm all for female empowerment, but she was murdering people. I mean, is that not okay? I kind of thought that was bad, you know? So, yeah, whatever. I just thought that was a goofy way of looking at this part of the story, which clearly wasn't about that. And there's all this other stuff that we talked about last time about how women were not as powerless as some analysts or, you know, scholars seem to think that they were. But any hoodles. So we get back to, enough of that. So we get back to Beowulf. He elects Queen Hygd, Hygd, is pronounced Hygd. The G's are silent. She shows up with this necklace, okay? Or I'm sorry, Whalevale gave Beowulf her necklace. It was this beautiful golden necklace. And the poet obsesses about this bloody thing. So there's some meaning to it, I think. Of course, a lot of people have commented on this. The poet says that the necklace was like the necklace of the Bronzings, which refers to some story that nobody knows anything about anymore. It's a reference to something that must have been lost. But it sounds a lot, even the word sounds a lot like Freya's necklace, the Brisingamen. And they were, of course, cousin cultures. And he goes on to talk about how he talks about the necklace of the Bronzings, which Whalevale's necklace reminds him of, and how it was won in a struggle in a shining palace by a mighty warrior named Hama. Any Lord of the Rings fans out there will recognize that name. And so, again, the poet is taking this story and applying it to what's going on right now. It's a fantastical story of the past and saying it's reflected here again in what we're seeing now. He did this with by comparing Beowulf to Seaman, the Dragon Slayer. Okay. So she gives him this necklace. He goes and gives it right to Hylak's king, or Hylak's queen. Then he goes on to tell us the fate of this necklace. It's another one of these seemingly mystifying sidebars that used to frustrate scholars in the old days. Why are we talking about this now, right? Beowulf just got home, right? We got other stuff to do. No, we want to talk about this silly necklace. But there's a meaning to it. He gave it to Hylak, who squandered it. He took the treasure off on, I don't know what he was doing with it, but he ran off somewhere, stirring up feuds. And that's when he, got himself killed. Beowulf then comes in and says, I'm going to go get that necklace back. He went on a raid. He went and got it back. He killed plenty of people and then swam home carrying 30 coats of mail, I guess, swimming across the northern sea, because he's Mr. Awesome. And then we have the necklace back. Okay, so what is going on here? What is the symbol of this necklace supposed to be about, you think? Any thoughts on that?
Positive relating, and I mean it's I think it's a sign. I mean, it's psychologically right. It's the sign of almost a gift to the ego in some way, right? Or a gift to Beowulf being that kind of new resolution, the overcoming.
It's a symbol of the bond itself.
Yeah.
I think in the same way, a ring, as a potent symbol. And so is the necklace. That's why they're so popular. But it's a feminine symbol, right? Not that men can't wear necklaces, but I mean, it's typically associated with females throughout many cultures, including this one.
Yeah.
He compares it to the necklace of the Bronzings. It reminds us of the Brisingamen, both of which were necklaces that belong to either a goddess in the case of Freya or somebody elevated to a high level in the the Anglo-Saxon version of the story. So it's like you say, a positive relating connected to the anima function.
Yeah.
The anima is about relation.
Yeah.
And of course the animus is too. And the fact then that he tells us that this thing goes through all of these convoluted, lines, but he goes through all the trouble of going and getting it back. What does that say about Beowulf?
He's not willing to relinquish that bond.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's giving us again a picture in word or in images of the activity of it's another way that we use images to depict more complex concepts that are harder to verbalize.
So symbolic, right? I mean, it's in the necklace of its in and of itself is symbolic, but this entire narrative is symbolic of again that kind of overcoming, that integration. You now have rapport with the unconscious. You've gone to the depths. You decided to do this. You have now positive relating, and then trying to spread that out into the world, and wanting to ensure that that isn't lost, right? Is really important.
Right. So, as we know, the persona is the piece that we use to help relate to the external world, and the way that Jung put it anyway, that the anima or animus is the way that we relate to the unconscious, to the collective, the objective psyche. And we've dealt with the two already. So we've got Grendel was the complex that was trying to keep us pulled back into that infantile state, lashing out in rage only. And then Grendel's mother was kind of a reflection of that as it relates to connection and strong bonds of connection. That stuff's all been overcome now. Beowulf navigated that with great difficulty, but he did it. And so the necklace, I think, is a symbol of the prize, of the gold, right? And that theme is used all over the place in the poem. And of course, it's kind of an archetypal symbol, I think.
Yeah.
Well, not kind of, it is, of value. The things of greatest value are depicted as gold objects, and I think it's just connected to our experience of the sun and how we're diurnal creatures, and you can trace that all back in the usual manner. But then, speaking of that, we now fast forward to the time when Beowulf is king. And the poem just zips forward 50 years and says, okay, he's been king for 50 years now. And then we get a bunch of flashbacks. So it's very, very interesting the way that he uses time here. Yeah. Not terribly out of the ordinary for storytelling to do this, but maybe for other poems of that era, I think it is kind of unusual. It's very modern, actually. A lot of modern storytellers, like Nolan, does this kind of stuff. He'll fast forward and then tell us stuff in flashback, but then it all comes together at the very last bit. And so he's doing that too, and I think for the same reason. It's that if you're fast forwarding 50 years to a very key moment near the end of his life, when the dragon shows up, then all the stuff that's happened is going to echo in that moment. Yeah. So it zeroes in, right? And of course, the poet, this means that the poet probably studied Aristotle's Poetics, because Aristotle recommends you do this in that book, classic book on fiction writing, is to make the key transition to whatever it is that you're writing about happen in a short period of time in a narrow space. Right? I don't know if you knew that. It's a classic technique used all the time. Even modern storytellers still do that kind of stuff. Think about, I'll use one example, Star Wars. Okay. So everything that has happened in that whole story, we're talking about A New Hope. Yeah. That whole story, the theme boils down to trusting in the Force or not. Right? Luke's arc is that he has to learn how to trust in the Force, but you can't just have an arc of a story where the guy says, okay, I trust the Force, and then the story's over. No. You've got to have him do something to demonstrate it, and it's got to be super high stakes. And if possible, it's got to be in a really narrow time of space and physical space, right? So a short period of time and a narrow space. That's the trench. So in the trench, the time is running out. The planet's getting ready to get blasted to smithereens and the rebel base killed. And he's got to make that one decision of whether or not to follow the navicomputer or trust in the Force to help. And he's got one shot, right? So that's when he makes the decision and he wins. And that's the whole point of the story, is that, and it's interesting that this shows up, that this story came about in the 1970s, when there was quite a bit of the sort of mechanistic view of the world still very prevalent. And this, and Lucas comes along and tells this hippy dippy story about, believing in the mystical energy of the universe, blah, blah, blah. But it's all clothed in fantasy. So it gets past skepticism and goes right to the heart, and everybody goes bonkers over it. I was there, Gandalf. I was there 3,000 years ago. I remember being the lines and everybody going crazy about it. I was one of them, but it's taken me a long time to figure out why.
Yeah.
One of the big pieces of it. So the consequences then follow from there. They win and all that. So, yeah. So here we are then at this pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Is when he's got to face the dragon. And then everything that is interesting or of relevance will then be delivered to us in flashback. Anime do that. Anime stories do that a lot too. So the dragon, though, has been there for centuries. He's been there the whole time, just sitting on a huge pile of treasure. And so before anything else happens, right, all the poet does is says the dragon shows up and he starts wreaking havoc. But then let me tell you about how he got there. Let me tell you about all of this stuff. And nobody in the poem would have known any of this. So it's just the poet delivering exposition to us for context. And one of the fun ironies of this story is that the treasure hoard that the dragon was sitting on was buried by a lone survivor of a great kingdom of ancient days. How in the world does the poet know about that if he's the last survivor? Right? Doesn't matter, right? We're in story space, right? The rules are different. So they're at the top of the cliffs by the sea. This last survivor, the last known survivor of his whole people. Everyone else is dead. He's lamenting this. He takes all the treasure and he puts it into this cave. And then he just sort of falls on top of it and dies. After he gives this very poetic lament in this grand Old English style, which I'm sure that's exactly what he did. And then he, collapses on this heap of treasure. And then the dragon comes to sit on the treasure. There's two ways you can interpret that. You can say that, you can take it literally and say the dragon comes along and finds the treasure and decides to chill out on it. Or you can say the last survivor became the dragon. And that's not unprecedented in Germanic lore. In the story of Sigurd, for example, it was the dwarf who transformed into a dragon after sitting on a pile of treasure for long enough. So there's something about the treasure and the dragon and all that kind of thing. But before I go on, what is this all about? What is this stuff? So we've nailed down the Grendel. We've nailed down Grendel's mother. What is the dragon?
Death.
Yeah.
The inevitability of death, and the dragon is treasure. He's sitting on a pile of treasure, and it's almost as if there's so many things, so many avenues we could take, going into that in terms of what it is symbolically. But yeah, no, to be succinct about it, I think it's death. I think he represents death. Yeah.
And what does death really and truly mean?
Right.
I mean, most of us realize what death means on a superficial level as children.
Mm-hmm.
But the poet is not interested in that. The poet is interested in what the full context of death really is about.
Yeah.
And the inevitability of it, and the fact that it is unbeatable.
Mm-hmm.
But more than that, like, are you worried about a loss of your own life? Because a lot of people will say,
right,
that's not so much what it's not the fear that they're afraid. That's not the thing they're afraid of.
Yeah.
Oftentimes.
It's your name. It's your what you leave behind.
Legacy.
Right? Your legacy. Exactly. Yeah.
So it's about others. It's about your connection to others. Right. And that's what identity is.
Yeah.
So I am this person because of the way I relate to all these other things. Identity is not something that comes magically ex nihilo from within. It's built up through the connections.
Yeah.
So then that's the thing they're afraid of, loss.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this depiction is so spot on accurate, because this is the last survivor. He's lost everything, all of the people. The treasure is just a picture of that in concrete physical form.
Mm.
And the fact, it's not so much that, I mean, he still got the treasure, right? Why can't you just sit on it and enjoy it? And the argument of the poem is that sitting on it and enjoying it and hoarding it for yourself is what makes dragons.
Mm.
See, it does this in a sort of way of not being explicit necessarily about he transforms into a dragon, but you don't really need to do that. It draws the dragon to it. That's close enough to connect the two.
Mm.
So the treasure represents, it's not so much what it is, but what it does. And those treasures, every bit and piece of that treasure has a story behind it. Where it came from, who gave it to him, what was the mighty deed that was done in order to earn that, all of that stuff, right? So I bet Beowulf at this point could have walked into his own treasure hoard that it was no longer his, but it doesn't matter because, yes, it is. It is. It's the treasure hoard that belongs to the Geats, but he can look at each and every one of those pieces and say, that's one that I got by defeating Grendel.
Yeah.
And nobody can dispute that. And it's a concrete physical object. It's sitting there. It's got weight. It's got mass. It's undeniable. And everyone can look at it and say, that's awesome. He doesn't need to keep it.
Mm.
But that's not where the true value of it is. The true value of it is in the story that went behind it and the narrative.
It's the DNA of the narrative.
Yeah.
The fact that he gave it away, right, is his lineage.
Yeah,
that's his legacy.
exactly. That's the other part of it, right? Is that not only did I earn that,
yeah,
then what did I do with it? Because I am so behind us as a team, as Geats.
Yep.
That I gave it up. And who can dispute him? Nobody. So then when he became king, so this is the thing I think modern leaders have no inkling of, is that you just sort of get voted into office, right?
Mm.
And then, you're the leader. Okay,
Yep.
That's great. But nobody trusts you. No, there's nothing like this kind of bond there.
Yeah.
Because none of that stuff, that hard-earned stuff about the treasures and everything else goes into it. It's just, some rich guy, a bunch of people voted for him because he, promised them X, Y, and Z.
Mm.
But imagine Beowulf, when he takes the crown, not only has he got the treasure behind him, but the fact that he turned down being given the title of king, because he said, it doesn't logically go to me. Heid's son was the next in line. Later on, he died. And so the whole kingdom was like, you're the dude.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or not, you're the king. So that's how he became king. After all, you don't vote for kings. Anyway. So then at that point, the support of the people is very strong because he's bloody well earned it after all that time. So that adds to the cohesion.
Yeah.
Which was so important in those, especially in that time, frame where an incoherent tribe is going to get wiped out. So here the dragon then represents the disruption of all of that. Now, so it's not just about death, the individual, but death, the whole culture, death in general. Very terrifying.
Yeah.
And the poet does something very interesting here. He actually, if you look at experts that have looked at the language, like the Old English language, I'm not an expert in this, but they've noticed that he uses the similar poetic and linguistic structures to describe Beowulf and the dragon, to connect them to the two, similarly the way he did with Grendel. And again, the poet personifies the dragon a lot, gets inside its head and tells us what the dragon is thinking, which is very unusual for that time. Tells us that the dragon is restless. He's looking forward to burning and killing. He's looking forward to every night when he can crawl out and slaughter and destroy. And there's a sneaky little thing in there that it's like, well, okay, wait a minute. Does that mean he can't just fly off and wreak havoc during the day? Apparently not. He has to sit and wait and be restless and carrying on until nightfall before he can do that. Who makes that rule? Okay, the psyche makes that rule, because darkness represents the unconscious. It represents an inward look, because that's where we turn inwardly when the darkness is there. Because we're again, it's all based on the visual system. Ultimately. The rules of this symbolism and why it's universal is because we all have the same physiology, and that it works its way into our symbols, and that's why the dragon can't come out during the day. The psychological symbol. It's one of the things I look at to say, see, it's not just me making this stuff up and putting some hokum on it. It's there. It's in the fabric of the poem. Okay, so at this point, Beowulf feels guilty, which is the first time we've seen him do this. He takes pause. He's like, did I bring this on? Did I make a mistake? Well, what do you make of that? That's an interesting thing to pause on.
He's considering his responsibility, and I think it's he's kind of reflexive and introspective enough to say, like, okay, how am I contributing to this? How is this partially my fault, potentially? Yeah.
And remember, so like the first half of the poem, we had at the end of his two victories, we had all of that stuff about watch out for inflation.
Right.
And at this moment, I think he's flirting with a negative inflation. There was absolutely nothing that can be done about this dragon. Nada. And him thinking about maybe I did this is a temptation of negative inflation that the ego can sometimes succumb to, where I think the bad things that have happened are attributed, it's my fault, right? When it's like, nah, you're not that important. Sorry. You're not that powerful. Get over yourself, right? You can't. But it's it's a bottomless pit you can get sucked into, right? You know this. Now, luckily for our hero, Beowulf doesn't do that, but he does pause, right? So I think that's very human of him to do. And then the poet says, but then he decides, okay, I'm not going to think about that anymore. I'm going to plan revenge, right? Because that's what he does so well. So if it isn't my fault, or if I'm not even sure if it's my fault, regardless, I still got to do something about it.
Exactly.
So I'm going to act. That's what he does. But of course, at this point, what action can possibly result in victory here? The poet has already told us that he's about to meet his doom. So we already know ahead of time that he can't win this. But that's not the point. That's not the point. And this is such an important lesson. It's so funny that this lesson is embedded in this poem at this dragon fight. Maybe it takes somebody weird like me to notice this, but But I see this all the time. I run into this issue where a person I'm working with, a patient, is so concerned about something in their life, whatever it is. And I say, but I've noticed you've not really acted on this. And they'll say, well, what good will it do? Like, so-and-so's upsetting me, but I don't want to tell them that because what good will that do? And so what they're doing basically is they're placing all of the value on their action on the outcome.
Yep.
But you can't control the outcome.
Yep.
Not entirely. That's why the poet keeps beating us over the head with God and Beowulf.
Yeah.
Never one, never just the other.
Yep.
Always both. So, but you've still got to do your part, which means you've got to act without knowing what the outcome is. Sometimes you've got to act even if you know you can't win, because that's not the point. The point is that you acted. And it's based on the idea that the action and the outcome are hyper dependent on each other in a sense, but the action is an end in and of itself.
Yeah.
Going to face the dragon is the action.
Right.
It's not defeating him, it's facing him. That's what the point is.
Yeah, it's absolutely important, because it's about the satisfaction of the expression, not the outcome of the expression.
Bingo. That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's such a profound thing for people to realize.
Very powerful.
I think culture plays a large role in terms of that kind of conceptualization, that I need to be perfect. I need to do this perfectly, or no one's going to love me, right? And it's catabolic. It can really tear somebody apart.
It can make you, it can freeze you, it can petrify you, and you're terrified to act because, well, what if I fail? When it's failure or success is not the point. Sometimes in life, it's just not the point.
Right.
The fact is that you go up and face the dragon at all is the point.
Right.
So just like we've talked about how we can run into Grendels in our life, we can run into Grendel's mothers in our life. We can also face dragons.
Yeah.
Now, an interesting thing that he does here, the poet, is that he goes on to this, another one of these sidebars, right? But the sidebars have a point because they're juxtaposed with what's going on in the narrative, and they inform the narrative through telling of a different story that's similar. But again, the poet doesn't make a lot of noise about this because that wasn't the style of his day. The appositive style was, you say this, then you say that, and you let the audience figure out the rest. Maybe they were smarter listeners back then. I don't know.
I think they had to be.
Yeah, I guess so. So what we're basically talking about here is that the dragon is the symbol of hopelessness. So it's not just death, but the hopelessness of death. Death is just death, right? It's not really a monster. It's just what it is. It's just a thing that happens. What turns it into a monster is when it becomes this hopelessness and despair that draws you into everything is my fault. I'm just not going to do anything. It's hopeless. And so that's what he's really fighting here.
Yeah.
But the poet, again, never cheats. He never shows us Beowulf just showing up and fixing everything, like James Bond. He doesn't really even have to break a sweat. He just shows up and everything goes his way. No, not in the least.
While drunk.
Yeah, while drunk. Right, exactly. Right. With one hand behind the wheel. So instead, he sits at this chair that's sitting in front of the cave where the dragon lives, and it's surrounded by rivers of flame, and it's very dramatic. And he's sitting there and he's pondering. And he reflects on what happened to his grandfather. So at this stage, again, the reason why I say that dragon is a symbol of hopelessness is not because I'm projecting that idea onto the poem. It's in the poem. The poet tells us this through these sidebars. His grandfather's two sons, one killed the other one accidentally. This is a sidebar. And he watched his grandfather die of grief over that, because you can't take revenge on your own son who accidentally killed your other son. And so that nevertheless soured his feelings over the son who survived. And so in a sense, he lost them both and just died of grief. Mm. He has his grandfather's sword at this moment. It's called Mailing. And he fights a dragon with it, and it breaks. Okay. There you go. So I don't need to explain that too much. That's fairly straightforward. But then he says, he doesn't stop there. Beowulf doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He ponders the story, and then he takes another step forward and abstracts it into a larger, more universal type of story. He says it's as if it's like a father who watches his son die for a crime he committed.
Yeah.
I can't get revenge against anybody for killing him, right? Revenge was the way of handling grief back in those days, right? Mm-hmm. It was a way of channeling the rage of grief that we all fear. And if that was stymied for whatever reason, that was felt to be a great loss. Mm. That's why when Beowulf faces all of this awful stuff, he says, well, let's plan revenge, right?
Yeah.
But then the poet says, yeah, but there's some times when you can't do that. Then what? Then what do? You're faced with hopelessness, you're faced with grief, and there's nobody you can go beat up to get it, fixed, to at least, right the wrong in your eyes. There's a lot of this in Batman too, by the way. Okay, but it's in a modern context, so it channels it in very different ways, but the root of it is universal. It's archetypal. Anyway, so then he says, that is the situation that I'm facing now. And the poet doesn't say, and Beowulf figures it out and says X. No, he shows us what Beowulf does about it. He doesn't sit there and ponder or come up with any great piece of wisdom. He gets up, pulls out his sword, and fights a dragon. So, all right, I've thought about this enough. Let's go. That's got to be the answer. And it turns out to be the correct answer. But it's not preachy, and it's not easy, and it's very profound. It's another instance where I think the poet he must have earned it.
Yeah.
He must have been someone who had been through some stuff, or he was, very old. And by virtue of that, he's seen all kinds of stuff, death and destruction. I mean, he lived in the 9th century, so mayhem and carnage.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Not like today. So at this point, Beowulf he's lost his father early. He lost 2 of his uncles, his grandfather, and his beloved king.
Yeah.
So he's there. He's the last survivor, in a sense. And actually, it's not just a sense. I mean, he is the last survivor in a sense here, but at the end of the poem, he literally is.
Yeah.
Because the poet tells us in the messenger's prophecy that the Geats will all get wiped out.
Yeah.
Because of the machinations of the raids that were set in motion that Beowulf had nothing to do with. So, whereas before we saw Beowulf was not facing alienation from other people, but from life itself. So this was like a breaking of the bonds of ego and nature. That's why I think the dragon represents despair, grief, and hopelessness. Mm. And so the way to challenge and fight despair and hopelessness is to not outsmart yourself by saying what I do has to have the correct outcome or else I'm not going to do it. That's not the answer here. The answer is facing it, basically letting go of the outcome and facing it anyway. That's not easy to do. That's tough.
Well,
that's tough.
You've talked about this a lot in your work too, in terms of the kind of surfacing of panic when there's a lack of utilization or a lack of kind of mobilization there, and how panic can coincide with not only a sense of hopelessness and depression, right? And it's almost like it's telling you, you need to do something regardless of what it is, and it's listening to that instinct. And yeah, I think the poem does a very good job of not only describing that Beowulf has to do something, but also that all these others didn't do something, or at least has examples of others that didn't do something.
Right. Yeah. So the answer to this conundrum, this impossible problem that the poet has set up for us, says the answer is maybe not what you think. It's not to just be the amazing warrior who defeats everything. No. The answer is simply courage and going up to engage with it at the best that you can. And so in sort of talking himself up into this, right, he goes through this pondering, and then he speaks bold words, then he strides forth and does great deeds. So there's this thought, word, deed pattern that's repeated throughout the poem every time he has to face one of these big baddies, which again is so human, right? How do you work yourself up into this? The poet says it's not easy. Here, let me show you how you got to do it. You got to first ponder the depths of this, really examine it. What is this like? What is the deeper principle? It's exactly what he's doing here at the bluff. Then he says, that's not enough though.
Yeah.
You still got to talk. You've got to speak the words, pronounce them, right? Verbal acts of creation. Then you will have the strength to do it. And he says at that point, I may win or I may lose, but not 1 foot will I retreat from this barrow keeper. And then the poet, of course, adds on to that and has this couple of lines here. He says, the famous champion stood up with his shield, brave behind helmet and hard war shirt, went under stone cliff, trusted the strength of a single man, hardly the coward's way. I just love that. So it's like anytime you want to talk yourself into something that's going to be scary or tough, just, read a couple of lines of that and you're like, once more into the breach, that kind of thing. But I mean, it's amazing how that can be effective.
Yeah.
But you've got to be prepared for it, right? You can't, if you're latched onto the outcome, you say, but no, then none of those words are going to matter. But we might lose, but we might this, but this might happen. Well, what if? That destroys it.
Yeah. And I think it not being attached, but also understanding why you feel the way you do to do it, right? And it's not just like a cognition, and I think that's the beauty of the narrative and why these stories are so archetypal, is that you can sit back and cognitively think through, yes, like, wow, like these heroes are doing this, and this, it's happening here and here and here, and it is transpersonal and all that. But then in your own life, how do you feel that? Like, where is that feeling coming from? Because I'm sure, in those moments of courage, the feeling, there's a lot of experiential affect, right? There's so much there. And I know the saying, it's like, well, you should most likely do the thing that you're most afraid of. People talk about that all the time. I don't think that's necessarily true in terms of a blanket statement, but there is a truth there in that the greatest of deeds, the most courageous, usually involve those that are partaking in them being not feeling so courageous,
Yeah.
And I'm like, if you're in a situation where, Beowulf is in a situation, it's imminent doom. Like, it is going to happen. There is no other outcome. But he does it anyway.
Right. Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah. Courage is not a person who feels no fear.
Yeah.
A courageous person is someone who feels it and does it
anyway.
Does the thing anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but of course, a skeptic might come along and say, well, yeah, but how do you do that? And that's why I think the poem is so brilliant, is because it does explain it. It tells you how. And it's not just a cognitive exercise in rational, sorting out all the equations, right, and figuring out this is my percent chance of success. No, he says this is just like a grieving father. Right? He connects it to real world, emotionally powerful things that he's experienced. And he says, in fact, it's even worse. This is like me facing the death of a son, for a crime that I can't revenge, and so I just got to watch it and deal with it. It sucks.
Yeah.
you know. But then do I want to be like my grandfather who, or the last survivor, both of whom did the exact same thing, which is wither away and perish in grief? And it said, or am I going to go out a different way? Am I going to go down swinging, as it were? And, you know, it may not matter in terms of the outcome. You might, both people end up dead. You die of grief, or you die fighting a dragon, right? But it isn't about the outcome. It's about overcoming the hopelessness and the despair. And that has repercussions afterwards to others that you've connected yourself to. So they outlive you, and then they feel the repercussions of that. We know this because Beowulf felt it when he watched his grandfather die. So that's why that piece is so important to have right at this moment, for him to have that flashback, because it puts everything that he's dealing with now into context.
Yeah. And having that memory come up with all those feelings, right? And then that's the last scream of life, right? That yell of life, which doesn't just, again, it is archetypal. It doesn't just happen here. It happens everywhere.
Yeah. Last surge. And it can be a very difficult battle to fight, that overwhelming feeling of hopelessness.
Right.
Very powerful. It's a dragon. Right? You can't just go up and beat it up. You can't. So I guess next time we'll see exactly what he does and what happens.
I'm looking forward to it.
Smackdown.
Yeah,
What's that?
I'm looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, Dr. Goodwin, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.